Despite the focus on friends and family, polls suggest that the holidays can be among the most stressful times of the year, especially for people who are hosting out of town guests. So you can guess that it might have been somewhat difficult for the President and First Lady to host the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for Christmas, just 2 weeks after the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. The Christmas of 1941 wasn't the first time that Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill had met in person, nor by any means would it be the last, but it arguably maybe was the most consequential, and quite possibly the most important Christmas ever at the White House. It is history that deserves to be remembered. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the U.S. was thrown into a war that they were both expecting and unprepared for. But while December 7th may have been, as the president would declare on December 8th, a date which will live in infamy, at least one world leader slept better that night. In his own recollection, recording in his history of the Second World War, after hearing of the attack, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved. France had capitulated in the armistice of June 1940, and Britain, along with her empire, had stood alone against the Third Reich until Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union a year later. The two had officially become allies with the Anglo-Soviet Agreement signed 12 July. Roosevelt had worked to stretch all boundaries of neutrality to assist the embattled allies. But despite material support via cash and carry and Lend-Lease, the outlook was still bleak. The Office of the Historian of the U.S. Department of State notes, by the end of May, German forces had inflicted humiliating defeats upon British, Greek, and Yugoslav forces in the Balkans and were threatening to overrun Egypt and close off the Suez Canal, thereby restricting British access to its possessions in India. When the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, few policymakers in Washington or London believed that the Soviets would be able to resist the Nazi onslaught for more than 6 weeks. Churchill wanted the U.S. to enter the war. Perhaps Roosevelt did too. He understood that war was inevitable, and that prospect almost certainly impacted his decision to seek an unprecedented third term in 1940. In August, the two made secret plans to meet, their first meeting since the outbreak of war. Ostensibly, the Atlantic Conference, held aboard the cruiser USS Augusta August 9th to 12th, was to outline British and American goals for the post-war world, working from the assumption, certainly in question at the time, that Nazi Germany would be ultimately defeated and that the United States and United Kingdom would play significant roles in the post-war world. But the Charter, a list of principles that impacted several post-war agreements, represented what can only be called a failure of the conference to achieve the goals of either Roosevelt or Churchill. The Office of the Historian continues. President Roosevelt had hoped that the Charter might encourage the American people to back U.S. intervention in World War II on behalf of the Allies. However, public opinion remained adamantly opposed to such a policy. While Churchill's goal had been, the historian explains, to get America into the war. But the U.S. was still divided on the subject, and many echoed the sentiments expressed by Mr. H.G. Dodson, quoted in an August 15th edition of the Amarillo Daily News. "I would take a gun myself and fight to defend this country," the fiery Mr. Dodson said, "if the fight really is for defense." He continued by stating that he thought the United States had no business meddling in Europe's affairs. But the question of the U.S. entering the war was settled by the Japanese on December 7th. Churchill later wrote that the news filled him with the greatest joy, as the U.S. was now in the war, up to the neck, and in it to the death. Something he believed meant that England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Congress obliged. Roosevelt had given the speech at 12:30 p.m., and by 4:10 p.m., he signed the declaration of war passed by the House and the Senate. The United Kingdom declared war on Japan the same day. But the declaration offered a reason for concern for the Prime Minister. While the U.S. had declared war on Japan, they had not declared war on Germany. In fact, Hitler decided to declare war first, on December 11th. Churchill had numerous concerns, but foremost was the concern, according to a 2016 edition of the magazine of the U.S. National Endowment for the Humanities, that the pride and desire for revenge would lead Roosevelt and his military chiefs to focus on Japan. In fact, Churchill had already determined on December 8th to visit FDR. The prime minister wanted to make his case to the president and a new ally over how the war should be fought. He requested the permission to make the trip from King George VI, arguing that he needed to make the case for the U.S. to continue to deliver the war supplies it had promised, fearing that they would now be diverted to the U.S. military. He cabled Roosevelt on December 9th. Now that we are, as you say, in the same boat, would it not be wise for us to have another conference? We could review the whole war plan in light of reality and new facts. The website of the National Endowment for the Humanities notes the president, knowing full well what the prime minister was up to, expressed concern that the voyage across the Atlantic, which crawled through German submarines, might be too hazardous. Churchill waved away Roosevelt's fears about safety, arguing the bigger danger lay in not coordinating strategy immediately. Knowing how tenacious Churchill could be, Roosevelt quickly relented. "Delighted to have you here at the White House," the president wrote on December 10th. Historian and retired Brigadier General John Shortall wrote in his 2021 book, Arcadia, the First Wartime Council of Churchill and Roosevelt. The American chiefs of staff were not pleased when informed 4 days after Pearl Harbor that they would have to host the British military leaders at a conference in Washington. Their greater worry was that Britain had a grand strategy. They did not, and they preferred more time to prepare for the meeting. But events were unfolding quickly. The website for the National Endowment for the Humanities notes, the global picture was harsh and threatening, with each new angle in the conflict giving way to another. Even the attack on Hawaii was part of a larger Japanese offensive that included assaults on Guam, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Midway Island. Britain suffered ongoing losses from Japanese attacks on Hong Kong and Malaya. Churchill's 10-day trip across the Atlantic was made in secret aboard the battleship Duke of York. A 2017 edition of the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine noted that the Atlantic crossing was so rough that passengers were confined below decks for much of the journey. Churchill self-medicated with Mothersill's seasick remedy twice on the first day. His absence was noted. The website of the National Endowment for the Humanities explains it's not really possible for a prime minister to disappear from London without anyone noticing. There is only so long that regrets can be given and excuses made before people begin to speculate. German radio speculated on either Washington or Moscow. On December 22nd, however, they confidently announced that the diplomatic opinion is increasingly voiced that Churchill is in the Middle East. That same day, the Duke of York docked at Hampton Roads, Virginia. The Prime Minister was flown in a U.S. Navy plane to Washington, where he later wrote, "There was the President waiting in his car. I clasped his strong hand with comfort and pleasure." It wasn't just German radio that was surprised. In her 1995 book, No Ordinary Time, Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, the Home Front in World War II, author Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote that Alonzo Field, the chief White House butler, walked in an argument between Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady, it seems, had not been warned of the Prime Minister's visit, something of a strain on a hostess suddenly expected to entertain a dinner party of 20 guests. And the rest of the nation was just as surprised. A December 2018 edition of the Washington Examiner writes, on December 23rd, White House Press Secretary Steve Early herded some 100 journalists into the Oval Office for a press conference with President Franklin Roosevelt. Press conferences were much different then. They were held more frequently, and they were remarkably casual. FDR enjoyed the give and take with reporters, who simply crowded around his desk and peppered him with questions. The Fourth Estate loved him in return. He was a master of the game who could always be relied on for good copy. With America's involvement in the war just days old, the press knew that they would likely get good information that Tuesday. But nobody expected what greeted the newsmen as they rushed into the room. There, comfortably seated in a chair beside Roosevelt's famous cluttered desk, sat British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. If a lightning bolt had struck the room, the reporters could not have been more surprised. This was more than an unannounced state visit. Everyone realized it was a critical meeting of two new wartime allies. When members of the press complained they could not see the Prime Minister and asked him to stand, he not only obliged, but climbed up and stood on his chair. The New York Times reported that Churchill was somewhat shorter than expected, but with confidence and determination written on the countenance, so familiar to the world. The Prime Minister demonstrated his famous sense of humor. When a reporter asked how long the war would take, the Prime Minister responded, "If we manage it well, it will only take half as long as if we manage it badly." Churchill's visit lasted 3 weeks. A January 2017 edition of Smithsonian Magazine notes that Churchill turned the second-floor Rose Suite into a mini headquarters for the British government, with messengers carrying documents to and from the embassy in red leather cases. In the Monroe Room, where the First Lady held her press conferences, he hung up enormous maps that tracked the war effort. The visit was a work visit, and in that perhaps one of the most important of the war. As Smithsonian Magazine notes, those maps told a gloomy tale. Germany and Italy in control of Europe, from the English Channel to the Black Sea. Hitler's army besieging Leningrad. Japan sweeping through the Philippines and British Malaya and forcing Hong Kong's surrender on Christmas Day. That made Roosevelt and Churchill summit doubly important. The Allies needed an immediate morale boost and a long-range plan to reverse the tide of fascism. The Prime Minister had brought with him a retinue of 86, from high-ranking military officers and diplomats to clerks and private secretaries. Important decisions were made, including agreeing upon a Germany First strategy that the Allies would operate under a joint command. In an address to Congress on December 26, Churchill described the meetings as mapping out of our military plans, and for all those intimate meetings, the high officers of the armed services in both countries, which are indispensable for the successful prosecution of the war. But the visit was also about unity and about courage in a difficult time. The Prime Minister demonstrated his vaunted oratorical skills before Congress, saying, if you will allow me to use other language, I will say that he must indeed have a blind soul who cannot see that some great purpose and design is being worked out here, below of which we have the honor to be the faithful servants. It is not given to us to peer into the mysteries of the future. Still, I avow my hope and faith, sure and inviolate, that in the days to come the British and American peoples will, for their own safety and for the good of all, walk together in majesty, in justice, and in peace. The message resonated. The website of the National Endowment for the Arts writes, thunderous applause filled the chamber. Members of Congress and gallery occupants rose to their feet. Stepping off the rostrum, Churchill gave the V symbol for victory, prompting the chamber to roar again. Only after the Prime Minister's death in 1965 did Churchill's personal physician reveal a stunning surprise. After his speech to Congress, the Prime Minister suffered a mild heart attack, a fact that he hid even from the President. But as important as his business was, Winston Churchill's Christmas at the White House was also about the relationship between the two men who faced the daunting task before them. Smithsonian Magazine writes that Churchill and Roosevelt ate lunch together every day. In mid-afternoon, Churchill would often suddenly declare, "I'll be back," and then retreat for a 2-hour nap. Daytime was a prelude to his deepest work hours, from dinner long into the night. He kept Roosevelt up until 2 or 3 a.m., drinking brandy, smoking cigars, and ignoring Eleanor's exasperated hints about sleep. It was astonishing to me that anyone could smoke so much and drink so much and keep perfectly well, she later wrote. And the magazine notes, the 67-year-old Prime Minister proved an eccentric house guest. "I must have a tumbler of sherry in my room before breakfast," Churchill told Fields, the butler, "a couple of glasses of scotch and soda before lunch, and French champagne and 90-year-old brandy before I go to sleep at night." And, of course, they enjoyed Christmas, including attending church at Foundry Methodist on 16th Street, where the altar was flanked by the Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack. They dined on oysters on the half-shell with crackers, clear soup with sherry, celery, assorted olives, and thin toast, roast turkey, chestnut dressing, sausage giblet gravy, beans, cauliflower, casserole of sweet potatoes, cranberry jelly, grapefruit salad, and cheese croissants, and rolls, and finally plum pudding and hard sauce, ice cream, coffee, salted nuts, and assorted bonbons. Despite the clear importance of the strategic decisions that were made in the Prime Minister's 3-week visit to the White House in the Christmas season of 1941, perhaps more important was the message of unity, of courage, of hope, to a nation that was still reeling from the devastation of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Washington Examiner explains that in the Prime Minister's visit, America got the Christmas surprise that it needed. Given the grim time and the blackout conditions, it was unsure whether there would be a national Christmas tree lighting in 1941, but the lighting went forward. In 1940, the President and First Lady had decided that it should be a more homey event, and so instead of having the national tree out on the ellipse, they decided to hold it on the White House grounds, where 2 trees had been moved to just inside the fence on the south side of the White House. And it was there, 81 years ago today, on December 23rd, 1941, that the President and the Prime Minister spoke of the importance of Christmas. The President said, "Our strongest weapon against this war is the conviction of the dignity and brotherhood of the man which Christmas Day signifies, more than any other day or any other symbol. Against enemies who preach the principles of hate and practice them, we set our faith in human love and in God's care for us and all men everywhere." For his part, the Prime Minister noted the importance of Christmas to children. "Let the children have their night of fun and laughter. Let the gifts of Father Christmas delight their play. Let us grown-ups share to the full in their unstinted pleasures before we turn again to the stern task and the formidable years that lie before us. Resolve that by our sacrifice and daring, these same children shall not be robbed of their inheritance or denied their right to live in a free and decent world. And so, in God's mercy, a happy Christmas to you all. Perhaps only in the darkest hour can we grasp the true meaning of Christmas. From everyone here at the History Guy, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and a joyous holiday season to you and yours. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.